Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me in another of my wonderful interviews. Something slightly different from the normal stuff that we do on the channel today. However, there was a bit of controversy which drew my attention to this. We are going on the canals. Well, I wish we were actually literally going on the canals, but I'm going to be talking to a very nice gentleman from the Canal and Rivers Trust in a moment. But to qualify this, a few weeks ago, probably a month ago, last year now, a gentleman got in touch and was slightly concerned that his license on the CRT license, the Canal and River Trust license, was going up a bit more than another section of people on the canals. And he said it's very unfair. And could I talk to somebody? And me being an amiable sort of chap thought, well, okay, I've got an interest in canals because I do go holidaying on them. I think that the historic nature of them are extremely important. So much so that I've made a bit of a documentary a few years ago with the Shrewsbury and Newport Canal Trust, who are trying to put in an old canal that went out of service. And later on this year, I'm meeting up with them to do an update on how they're getting on. Meanwhile, there are lovely boaters up and down the countryside, going around the wonderful navigation and enjoying it. But there is a little bit of disgruntlement about fees, so we'll get into a little bit of that. But first, let me bring on to the show Matthew Simmons, who is the national, I beg your pardon, can't read my own writing, National Boating Manager for the Canal and Rivers Trust. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to be here.
And I should point out, although it looks like you're sitting there with the canal behind you, you're actually in a very echoey room, which is
I am.
unfortunate, but just so people are aware. So, Matthew, thank you very much for coming and agreeing to talk with us. I know I've got a number of questions that people have sent in to me, but I'm not going to subject you to a barrage of questions to put you on the spot, although they have perhaps influenced some of my conversation. But before we get going, I do vaguely remember when the rivers were run by the government, by the British Waterways, and then it got sold off, not sold off, or however it is, whatever you do to it, to turn it into a charity, and is now run by the Canal and Rivers Trust. Could you tell us a little bit about that history and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I suppose we should start way back because canals obviously go back over 200 years. And for most of that time, they were private entities run for business, for making profit, for moving goods around. And that carried on right through the Second World War. And it was really only after the Second World War they started, although they had had competition from railways for quite a long time, it was after the Second World War that they really kind of tailed off with motorways being built and freight moving on roads, that they stopped being profitable. And a lot of them had been bought by railway companies anyway, who wanted the land to build their railway lines. So gradually they fell into more decline as they were less maintained. And it was really in the kind of sort of late 50s and 60s when they started to be seen as something else, as a kind of leisure resource, as a way to be restored and repurposed for people to enjoy for cruising, for holidaying, for their leisure time. And that was thanks to, hundreds of volunteers who quite literally dug out canals and rebuilt them and repaired them, and organisations like the Inland Waterway Association that spearheaded that work. And and then, it was after the Second World War they became nationalised, a nationalised body, and became British Waterways and governed by the British Waterways Board. And so that's how they were managed from sort of the late 40s onwards, right up until 2012, which was when the coalition government, as was then, decided to make the canals an independent charity. So hence the Canal and River Trust was formed to hold the canals in trust for everyone, but to be responsible for maintaining them and keeping the navigations open for boating. Um, but our remit was really to sort of make the canals benefit as many people as possible. So that's really been our focus since 2012. And the way our charity was set up means that for the first 15 years, there's been a guaranteed grant from the government, which has covered about a quarter of the trust's income. But then we have other sources of income, some of which were passed on from British Waterways when we were formed. So things like land and assets that we owned, buildings that are used as sort of an investment to generate money, which we can then use to maintain the canals and waterways that we look after. But then we also get income from boat license fees, which make up about 10% of our income, another 10% from other boating activity like mooring fees, things like that. But then, of course, as a charity, we're able, much more than British Waterways was as a government body, to then try and raise our own money through donations, through going after grants and things like that. So we do have a very diverse range of income. Another thing that we get income from is from utility firms. So one of the brilliant things about canals is they run unbroken from city to city. So under a lot of our towpaths, we have things like internet cables that run along, and the utility firms pay us a fee for using that space. And in some cases, they actually move water um, through the canals. So, for example, Bristol, about half of the drinking water for Bristol is fed to the city via the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal. So we've got quite a diverse range of income that helps us maintain this fantastic network of waterways that we look after.
Would it be true that if you run out of money for any reason, and I'm sure you're constantly, look, we could all do with more money, especially at the moment, but would it be a situation that the government would let it fail?
So the question is asked of me sometimes, would waterways get sold off if you fail? Well, the short answer is no. They'd go back to the government if we failed. But we're not in the business of failing. We want to
No.
keep this fantastic network alive, and that the challenge for us is how do we do that when, in effect, it costs more to run than we can generate. So we have to be creative in how we keep the waterways open, how we maintain them going forward. So fail, I'm not sure we want it to fail. That's not a plan. But if the trust wasn't here, I think ultimately the waterways would then turn to the government's responsibility.
Yes, I mean, I was just on the from the historic point. I was just interested there, really, from the historic point of view, that people across the whole nation, hopefully, who are interested in the assets of England, would not, and Wales, would not want the canal system to disappear if a trust was unable to pay for it. So that's it's reassuring. One of the questions that I would love to know is how many people are using it and what type of people. Obviously, boats are on there, but presumably you have a lot of other activities going on the canals.
Yeah, so we have a lot of boats on our waterways, over 35,000, which is probably more than any time in their history. But the waterways are used by millions of people every week to walk along the towpaths, to take their dog out, maybe go for a run. We also have thousands of people using them for angling, um, water sports, paddleboarding, canoeing, increasingly popular since the lockdown. So there are millions of people every day using their waterways close to them, which is fantastic. It's what's really special about the waterways and the canals and rivers we look after is that they just touch so many communities. They run through all the big, in cities that across the country, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Birmingham, London, Bristol. Waterways touch all these fantastic places, and they're close to people. So you don't have to get in your car to go and enjoy the canal or the river. You can normally walk there really easily to enjoy it.
Like all things that are just there in the landscape, people often just take them for granted. Is that something that happens with the canals and
Well,
the
I think
rivers?
historically, perhaps yes, and to an extent today, I think a lot of people aren't aware that it's a charity that is looking after the canals and rivers. And some people probably think it's their local council or maybe it's the government. So one of our challenges is to make people aware that this is an amazing thing that you've got access to. You can go and walk or boat or cycle or along your canal. But it's a charity that's looking after that. And so we really need your support to help us keep it alive and used.
What are the major challenges then in order to keep it alive? Because I know from a recent last year, I was west of Aldermaston on the Kennet and Avon Canal, and you can see some of the old locks are a bit tired. Some of them are leaking. The gates probably need changing. And in the documentary that I made some years ago, we saw one of these great big oak things being changed, and it's not an easy process. You don't sort of do it in an afternoon. It's quite a massive concern, which of course locks down sections of the canal. What are the major challenges and things that cost the most on the canals that most people wouldn't think about?
Well, there are many. How long have
Yeah,
you
I
got?
bet.
Well, we've got the canals are largely 200 years old. They're outdoors in all weather, all seasons, so they take a lot of wear. So just the basic things like keeping water in the canals is a big challenge.
Mm.
People assume often that they're like rivers, they're natural, which of course they're not. They're man-made. Um, People don't see this, but we've actually got many reservoirs all over the country that were built to feed our canals. So as well as looking after the canals that you see, we've got reservoirs on top of moors in remote places that actually help feed the waterways. But we also have to move water around to keep water everywhere. So we spend £1 million a year on electricity, pumping water backwards and forwards up flights of locks so that the water's still in the canal. So those are the kind of basic day-to-day challenge of keeping water in. But then the infrastructure is obviously really old and needs constant care and attention. So we always have planned preventative maintenance, whether that's greasing the locks or clearing vegetation and doing those things. But each winter, we tend to have a period where we'll do the major works, where we're replacing lock gates, um, relining canals, repairing brickwork, repairing culverts, a huge number of jobs. And it's a constant challenge to keep on top of that. In the reality, we have a finite amount of money, which over the last few years has been put under a huge amount of pressure from inflation as the cost of materials has risen, the cost of labour has increased, the cost of electricity. So we have to sort of monitor all of our assets, we check and inspect them, we prioritize them, and have to use our money as efficiently as possible to try and repair and keep those canals open. So a pair of lock gates normally lasts around 25 years. So we're always in a cycle of, seeing how long we can keep the lock gates functioning before we have to, have the major work of replacing them, which happens during the winter.
Yes, and you obviously rely on a lot of volunteers, and we've seen them who are there helping people go through locks, perhaps who are not used to doing it for the first or second time, and dropping their windlasses and various things, and all of that. So it's useful to have them. Are your volunteers made more use of? One of the issues that came up in the correspondence I had was that volunteers are beginning to feel like they're being asked to do a lot more than perhaps they ever were.
So the key with volunteers is that you volunteer your time, and we're really grateful. Canals wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for volunteers who'd restored them and saved them from being lost forever. But volunteers choose what they want to do. But what we try and do is not try and sort of tell people what they have to do, but kind of encourage people to come forward and tell us what skills they have, what would they like to do. So as well as having hundreds of amazing lock keepers who help boaters through locks, we've got people doing all sorts of jobs, whether that's helping with vegetation clearance, going on
Yes.
boats to clear offside trees and things like that, reservoir inspections, helping in our archives, helping with some swing bridges. There's a whole range of jobs, but it's entirely up to the volunteers what they want to do. We can't force them to do. And what volunteers bring is extra to what we can do with our paid colleagues as well. We're really lucky. We've got over 4,000 volunteers at the trust now, and most of them come back year on year because they
Mm.
love doing what they do and they're really passionate about the canals. So they're a fantastic resource, and we're so grateful for them. So if anyone's out there listening and they're thinking, would you like to volunteer? Go on our website, get in touch with us. We're always keen to hear from people, and you'd be surprised at the different jobs you could be doing or things you could get involved with.
And I suppose at the end of the day, if you are feeling a bit overworked, you can just walk away.
Yeah, and sometimes volunteers decide they've done it for a few years and they want to do something else, or they take a break, and that's fine. It's their time. We're really grateful for what they donate in terms of their time and effort. But yes, they're volunteer. We don't compel them or force them to come back.
Well, let's talk about I mean, the major feature of the canals these days is not the old work boats that were delivering all the aggregate and corn and various farmers' things from the old days. Is, of course, the boaters, the leisure side of it. And I think that I think you even mentioned there's a lot more than ever was before. Are the canals and rivers at breaking point with the number of boats that there are on?
So I would never say that breaking point, but there are certainly parts of our network, and we look after about 2,000 miles of canals and rivers, and parts of that have seen a huge increase in boats more than others. So in London and the southeast particularly, we've seen a huge increase in boats over the last few years. So since 2012 in London, we've seen all boats have increased by about 90%. So there's about 4,000 boats on London's waterways now. But what's quite interesting is that there's been a bigger increase in boats that don't have a permanent mooring. So you can have a boat that's called a continuous cruiser. So you're constantly moving around. And what we're seeing in London is a lot more people living on their boats, moving around, but not having a permanent mooring. So that inevitably means it puts pressure on where there's space to moor, access to facilities like water and refuse and places to dispose of your sewage at Elsons or pump outs. There's more pressure on all those services. So, in some parts of the network, there's loads of space, lots of room, people go
Yes.
boating. In other parts, it's a bit busier.
And presumably, and these places that might be a bit fuller, like in London, is because people perhaps can't afford rents in houses or can't afford to buy houses where it's a bit cheaper to buy a boat. And is there enough space then for people to moor? I mean, you talk about the constant cruisers who have to move, every 2 weeks, I think it is, or something, if they found a space. Is there enough space for people?
Well, if you go to London, you'll see there is lots of moored boats continually
Yes.
moored along. So there is space. You sometimes have to travel a little bit further, or maybe you might even have to moor up against somebody. Generally, there is room for people to moor, but the more boats you get, the space doesn't grow. There's a finite
No.
amount of waterway. So it does mean that in some places you're seeing more boats moored further out. So the River Lee, for example, in East London, if you'd gone there 10 years ago, yes, there was a fair number of boats maybe in the Lower Lee, where the Olympic Park is, that area now. But as you went further out, you probably wouldn't see so many boats, whereas nowadays you will go a long way up the River Lee and you'll see lots of moored boats. So yes, you definitely see a change over the last decade in sort of numbers of boats.
And presumably there are more boats who are permanently moored or have a home mooring than the ones that don't, that are cruising around, who may be just like circling London because they work there, or indeed they might be because they just want to get away and have a nice life cruising around the whole navigation.
Yeah. So nationally, we have most of our boats have a permanent mooring. So of that 35,000, about 29,000 or so have got permanent moorings. So it's a smaller number nationally. But if you look at London specifically, it's now less than half of the boats have a permanent mooring. And partly that's because there aren't so many permanent moorings in London. So although we have seen an increase in boats with a mooring in London as well, um, there's been a far bigger increase in boats without a mooring. And that's sometimes because people can't find a mooring, or it might be they choose not to because it's more affordable, or they want to travel around. So there's different reasons people will have.
Yes.
But there's definitely, London is a sort of very different beast to the rest of the waterways that we look after.
So let's just talk about these fees then, because this is what sort of got people interested and were talking to me. Just give me an idea of how the structure of the boat fee is, because somebody who's only hired, it's not really been something that's been or borrowed, it's not been something that I've had to deal with. Is it, well, I'll get you to explain, but my question, I suppose, is it to do with the amount of people on the boat, or the length of the size of the boat, the size of the engine, whether you're cruising all the time, or whether you're or mooring, or you're just permanently moored?
Sure. So the boat license fee is generally calculated on the size of your boat. So it's a sliding scale based on the length. But there
Right.
is also an extra fee you pay if you have a wider boat. So there's two sort of additional charges depending on how wide your boat is. So broadly, it's a size-based fee. We do take into account usage as well. So, for example, if you're running your boat as a business, as a hire boat, or a cafe or a business boat, those boats pay a higher fee because they're generating income, so they're running them as businesses. But for leisure boats, which is slightly a mistitle, but it includes people who might live on their boat, it's a size based fee. But we have announced some changes from this April where we are going to start applying an extra charge for boats that don't have a mooring. So if you have a mooring, you're paying a fee for that mooring, not always to the Canal and River Trust, because over 90% of our moorings on the network are provided by other people, whether that's in marinas or private land adjacent to the waterways. So they're paying a fee for that mooring, and we get a contribution from whatever we charge the mooring operator to have access to our waterways. So they contribute for their license and their mooring fee. But for boats without home mooring, we are introducing additional fee over the next few years to reflect that the boats are on the waterways. They're moored, but they're moored on the towpath on the bank. But they also, we know that more people on continuous cruiser boats are living aboard. So they are using the facilities that we provide. We don't charge people for using water points, for refuse sites, or for Elsons to dispose of your sewage. But if you're living on a board boat, you are probably having to use those more often than perhaps if you're just going out at weekends or in your holidays. So the charge we're bringing is to try and reflect that extra utility you're getting if you're not paying for a mooring for your boat somewhere else.
If you're having to move around because there's no moorings, like in London or bigger cities, or what have you, presumably you are having to seek out these facilities. I mean, obviously you want people to use them. You don't want people to tip their rubbish on the bank willy nilly because they can't find a refuse point. So I mean, I guess the argument could be that they're disadvantaged because they're having to find it, or if there's closures on the canal, as we have seen. I've got friends who do YouTube channels on the canal, and they often say, oh, we're stuck in the winter between this and this because of works. They know that's happening because you advertise it on the website. That's not the big deal. But if they are stuck and they can't move, I guess there's an argument to say that they're disadvantaged as opposed to someone who's moored, where the facilities are going to be the same day after day after day. Is
Yeah.
that an argument that you can deal with?
So I think it's really important to say, if you're going to live on a boat and not have a mooring, it's a really different lifestyle to being in a fixed location. And we always say to people who are thinking about that, give it a try, do a hire boat holiday, do it before you commit to that lifestyle, because you have to think about all those things about where you're going to get your water filled up, where you're going to take your refuse, where you're going to get your sewage, whether you can get to shops or whether you've got tied down to a commitment in a particular place. It might not work for you, but for lots of people it can work, and it just requires a bit more planning. So yes, there will be times when there are stoppages, and normally they're planned. We try to minimize those unplanned stoppages. But where they are planned, and mostly that happens in the winter months. So we have a period where we do our major works when it's quieter, when there's fewer boats around on the waterways. And at those times, if there is a stoppage that means you can't get through, then we do take that into account and say, if you stopped for a reason that's outside your control, and we haven't given you lots of warning and you can't plan to go somewhere else, we take that into account. And certainly that's the case with any unplanned stoppages. So, for example, something breaks or a tree comes down. We factor those things in when we look at whether people are doing the movement they're required to do if they haven't got a home mooring. Um, in terms of facilities, we guarantee that we've set a standard now that you shouldn't have to cruise more than a day to access our facilities, or if it's a pump out, because some people use a pump out to empty their sewage tank, that's a bit longer. That's every 2 days. But those are sort of things you don't have to do every day. You normally would do those every week or two to access facilities. So you'd have to plan that, and that's part of the challenge of being a continuous cruiser. So it is a bit more hard work. We say it's a bit like having another part-time job, but it can be hugely rewarding, living around. Imagine being able to, moor up in amazing different places on the waterway, being close to nature. So there's benefits and challenges, and you have to consider both of those if it's right for you.
So, how much more will the constant cruisers have to pay as opposed to if they had a permanent mooring? Presumably, just before you answer that, if you've got a permanent mooring, you can still go and do your cruising as much as you like.
Sure.
It's just that you're paying for the mooring whilst you're not in it. So, but how much mooring? How much is the fee extra, or what's the percentage more
Yeah.
on the constant cruising?
So yes, if you've got a mooring, you can still come out onto the waterways, but it tends to be people who maybe don't have the time to boat that often. So our sightings tell us that, over 3/4 of the boats that we see on the waterways are boats without a home mooring, so the continuous cruisers. So the additional charge from April you'll be paying an extra 5% on top of the license fee, but that is going to gradually increase. So over 5 years, it'll increase to 25% on top of the standard license fee. And just to give people a sense of how much is a license fee, the average license fee is about £850 a year for a canal and river license. But if you only are on our rivers, then you get a 40% off that price. So it depends on where you're going to boat. But yes, it'll be increasing over a gradual period to help people adapt to that over the next 5 years.
So they don't pay council tax, presumably, and things like that because they're on a boat. So this is kind of your council tax type of thing.
Yeah, so council tax tends to be linked to a particular location. And obviously, if you're moving around, it's not really applied to people who are passing through. So people who will have a mooring, if it's a residential mooring, they generally pay council tax, but that's not applied to boats that can move anywhere over 2,000 miles, really. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's quite handy. There was another question that came to mind on the back of that, which is like all typical things have just slipped out of my mind. How does this affect people who are on holiday and hired? Presumably the hire prices will go up as a result of the license going up, will it?
So all of our license fees are going up from April, as part of the challenge of how do we, maintain this wonderful network and get enough money to contribute. We recognise boaters of any kind can't fund the full cost of our waterway network, and most of our income comes from other sources, but it's how they make a contribution towards that. So yes, all our license fees will go up by 6% in April, and that will apply to hire boaters and boaters with a home mooring and boaters without a home mooring as well.
Now, I have been sent pictures and videos of people being evicted from their boats. Now, I don't know the circumstances, and it's unfair of me to sort of challenge you why any specific one would go on that. Presumably, is there what's a standard that boats have to be on the water or moored permanently or anywhere? Because sometimes you do see boats and you just wonder how they are not taking in water.
So to have a license, you need to have insurance and you need to have something called a boat safety certificate. And the boat safety certificate is a sort of independent run scheme, which we are part of, and other navigational authorities like the Environment Agency as well are part of that. But that is really focused on making sure boats aren't a danger to other people. So it really looks at things like risk of fire and explosion and things that could injure other boaters or other people on the towpaths. So you have to have a boat safety examination certificate to show your boat is no risk to other people. So that's what you need to be on the boat. I know a lot of people look at boats, as you said, and think, oh, that doesn't look very good. But we're not there to police what boats look like. So providing they've got that insurance and safety certificate, they can get a license. But there are obviously things that you have to do as part of your license. So if you don't have a home mooring, you have to move every 14 days. You have to keep moving around and not staying one particular area all the time. So we look at those things. We do have people who don't buy a license, so they're not licensed. So we have to take enforcement action to manage fairly the waterways for everyone. And so our aim is to get everyone licensed and to make sure people are following the conditions of their license. And that's what our teams of licensed support officers and our rangers are doing day in, day out. But unfortunately, in some cases, there are people who don't want to pay a license or don't want to follow the rules. And as we're responsible for managing the 2,000 miles, we do occasionally have to remove boats from our waterways, but it's an absolute last resort. Because what we want is the boats on the waterways with a license and following the rules.
Do you pay VAT on the license fee? Unlike cars, you don't pay for MOTs or road tax. No,
Yes.
yes, you do.
Yeah. So I'm not a tax expert. Yes, the VAT is on the license. Yes.
Yes, and there's no way that you could ask the government to make that a reduction. It's just that was a question that had come in that somebody put, and I thought, oh, that's an
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
question.
Well, I mean, we're always looking at ways that we can get more money to support the canals. So, that's an area we could look at. Whether the government be willing to give us that back on it, I don't know if they would, but it's worth asking, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, well, I assume that as a charity you're VAT registered.
Yes.
Yeah, so everything that you charge would have VAT on it, and not everybody, of course, is going to be VAT registered to be able to claim it back. So they're having to pay a little bit more, which goes to the government, which at the moment some people may not want to be funding the government's unusual plans. Let's just leave that at that. There's prepayment plans, I gather. That if you have a prepayment plan over a certain length of time, can you get that cheaper if you're a constant cruiser?
So we do have some discounts for boaters. So obviously, as a charity, if we have the money in our bank account, then we can spend that and we can generate income on that money. So we do give a discount if people can pay their license in full at the start of the license period. But if you can't or you want to spread your payments, you can do it by direct debit over a number of months. So we do have payment plans for people to spread the cost of their license. And if people face difficulties, because we know that there are people on the waterways, just like everywhere, who maybe have challenges in their lives, we can arrange, if it's financial problems, we have a fantastic team of welfare officers that can offer support to people in need. And that could be lots of different situations, whether it's financial, they might have health issues, they might have mental health problems, they might have substance abuse. And those welfare officers, along with our licensed support team, will work with other agencies, health bodies, charities to get support to people in need. So, as well as the financial sort of support that might be available, there is other support if people have got a difficult period in their life that we try and help people with.
Somebody said to me that the claim that you're a charity is not true, that you're actually a corporation. Can you clarify that?
So we are a charity. We're a registered charity. We have very clear charitable objectives that you can look at on the Charity Commission website. And basically, what that means is, if we generate income or charge people and get income from whatever source, we have to spend it on those charitable objectives. So our primary function is to maintain the waterways for the benefit of everybody. So we're not a corporation or a business with shareholders where that money is dished out elsewhere. It has to be spent on our charitable objectives.
What are this year's biggest issues for you going forward?
Okay, well, there's always lots of big issues on the
Well,
waterways.
yeah.
One of the challenges. I'll give you an insight into one of the challenges. Over the 20th century, the waterways lost about 300 miles of canals got lost. But the good news was about 200 miles got restored and regained over time. Well, that's the good news story. But for all of those waterways where they put new locks in and we reopen them to navigation. All of those locks are coming up towards the end of their lifespan. So a lock normally has about 25-year lifespan. So because of that fantastic restoration work that happened around the millennium, it means in the next few years we have a very big spike in the number of locks that we're going to have to replace. So that means it's going to be more cost, and it's also going to be more challenge because there aren't many people who make locks. We're very fortunate. We have two workshops where we build and make locks for our waterways, but they're not the sort of thing you can buy off the shelf at B&Q. So
No.
there's a certain capacity of how much those workshops can make. So we have one of the challenges is to how do we meet that demand that's coming in the next few years. So we're looking at, can we build them in different ways to get more locks to our workshops? Can we hybridize them so have more of them made part metal, part wood? So not only will they last longer, but we can get different elements made in different places. So that's just one of the challenges. Another one that people won't see is the reservoir challenge. So you might remember a few years ago that there was a reservoir at Toddbrook where it had an extreme weather incident in August, overtopped the reservoir and nearly caused the spillway to collapse, which would have had a significant impact on the nearby town. So we have a lot of reservoirs, over 70 reservoirs, and we're having to maintain all of those to make sure they're safe. A lot of them were very early examples of reservoirs where they were built when the canals were built to provide water, but the understanding of reservoirs and the technology has obviously advanced a lot over the years. So we're spending £25 million over the next few years on major works to some of our reservoirs. So they're just two examples of the kind of infrastructure challenges we face. And they're made harder with the kind of changing weather patterns that we're seeing across the UK and across the world. We're having longer, drier summers, which means in the summer we maybe don't have enough water in our canals, and in the winter we're having these intense, wet periods where we have far too much water. I mean, over the last month we've had two major storms which brought down hundreds of trees. That's caused damage to embankments and other parts of the waterways. So we're having to cope with a lot of stress on really old, precious infrastructure.
So let me ask you this, because a lot of industries now are being forced into the green agenda or the net zero agenda and that sort of thing. Is any of that influencing what you do? Are you looking or moving towards electric canal boats and those sort of things, or any other measures to prevent global warming? I say that tongue in cheek because on this station we're not a great fan of these measures.
So we don't actually build boats. So there is definitely a movement towards greener boats, whether that's with more solar, more electric, or using biodiesels. But the waterways themselves can play a really important role in the challenges we face. So a couple of examples, when you have really hot periods, we know that cities and urban areas heat up more because of the effects of heat absorbed into buildings. But waterways actually have a cooling effect. So, there's a lot of research showing that by the water, then the temperatures drop. So there's a real benefit there that you will feel firsthand. But also, you can use the waterways to actually address some of the challenges. So you can use water to cool buildings. A lot of things like data centers use water drawn from rivers or canals to actually cool their electrics and then put it back into the waterway. But in the winter, you might be surprised to know you can do the reverse. You can take the heat that is constant in the water and draw it out, and you can heat buildings using a kind of heat pump extraction. So the canals can play a really important role in both um, physically making it nicer and more pleasant to be around in warm weather, but also acting as a solution to sort of provide cleaner, greener heating. And that's before you even talk about whether you could use hydropower. One other example that's happening is, we know in some parts of the country there are shortages of drinking water. So in the southeast particularly, where there's a lot more people living, there's real pressure on the water supplies. And so there's a scheme being developed to take water down the Grand Union Canal to feed the water, to provide drinking water, and then pump it out further down. And what that scheme could really benefit the canal is that to be able to do that, they'll have to invest in making sure the infrastructure is strong, that the locks are all good. So, that will have a benefit for other users of the waterway by using that investment and also addressing that drinking water challenge in the southeast. So there's some really exciting, innovative ways to use canals as well as the ones you think of, obviously.
Would any of the sort of green agenda stuff influence the canal and river trusts to shut down more moorings because they want to grow more plants or trees on the banks to prevent people from having space to moor up?
So we're not in the business of stopping boats on the waterways. The canals were built for boats, and we want boats on our waterways. It's always going to be a balance. We have that challenge at the moment about, we know that one of the reasons that people like being on the water is because it's close to nature, and we have lots of wildlife and habitats. So we're always going to have a balance in some places where we have to kind of manage the waterways for different uses. But that doesn't mean you can't have mooring. You just have to sort of design it in certain ways and manage where people can moor.
Well, yeah, I guess that's very sensible as much as you can. I'm just trying to think if they've got any more questions to put to you. I know that some of the answers, when you talk to a charity or any organisation, there's always those people who are affected, who are somewhat disaffected, sort of go, well, that you haven't answered the questions I want. Do you have a good relationship with the boaters on the whole?
Yeah, I mean, I spend most of my days, I've just come out of a meeting with about 10 boaters and spend a lot of time meeting, talking to boaters, going boating with people. So, yeah, we have a really good connection with our boaters. A lot of our boaters also volunteer for us, and the key thing about boaters is that they are passionate about the waterways. They love the waterways. We have boaters to thank for the fact they're still here, and we share that passion. We love our waterways too. And so working together, I think there's a promising future for canals and rivers.
So, do you encourage people if they wish to become either in a marina, if the marinas aren't already full, as people are looking at alternatives because the cost of housing is very expensive, to go to the canals as a choice to live?
Well, I often get asked this, can the canals solve the housing crisis? And the short
Yeah.
answer is probably not, because there isn't enough of them. And even if you kind of line boats up all the way along them, it's not going to make a dent in the kind of problems we've got with housing availability. But it is certainly a fantastic lifestyle, but it's not a accommodation solution, it's a lifestyle. So if it works for you, do your homework, find out, talk to people, go online, go and meet boaters, have a hire boat holiday, do all those things. And if it's right for you, it's a fantastic place to live, but it won't suit everybody and it won't solve the housing crisis, sadly, unless we build a lot more canals.
How stringent are you on the historical elements along the canals? I say this because I live in a seaside town, and over the last 30 years that I've been here, I've noticed that what was once a beautiful Edwardian, Victorian seaside town has turned into, it could be inner London. It's a sort of very bland looking buildings that are going up that are just not appropriate for the seaside. And that seems to be happening all around the coast. And I wonder if a similar thing is happening, that you're being enticed to build buildings alongside the canal, or permit these buildings without architectural integrity.
Yeah. So I suppose it's really important to point out that most of the buildings that are alongside the canal are not on our land, and we don't decide on those. There's like local government planning
Right.
departments, but we do comment on those and we try and influence them because we think it's really important that the historic nature of the canal, the things that people love about the waterways, is protected and done sensitively. If you are going to restore and build new things across the canal, we'd like them to see done well. And there are some really nice examples of that around the country. But the bits we do control, so the infrastructure, we look after the third highest number of listed buildings and scheduled ancient monuments in the country. Only the National Trust and the Church of England have got more than the Canal and River Trust. So when looking after those things, we have to make sure if we're restoring them or maintaining them, they are done in the way that is respectful of their heritage. So a couple of examples, when we restore our brickwork, we use lime mortar. When we restore our lock gates, we try and replace them like for like with what was there, so that we're protecting the thing that people love about the waterways, that history and heritage that makes them so special.
I'm going to show your website in a second, just so people can go and check you out and have a look. And if they're thinking of going on holiday and all those sort of stuff, you give lots of information. And also some of the questions that have influenced. I haven't, as I say, I haven't read out directly the questions because I wanted to have a conversation and just do this amicably rather than sort of some of the grumblings that people have. And how open are you to people coming with their complaints and their problems, and how transparent are you in the decisions that you make in the charity?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to talk to people. I talk, get lots, hundreds of emails every month, and try and answer people's questions. And happy to talk to people, even if we don't always agree. So we're very open in that respect. The way we're governed, we have a board of trustees, and so their meetings are minuted, and the decisions they make are public and published. And each year, we produce an annual report which tells you how we've spent our money and where we've got our money from, and explains some of the work we're doing. So we try and be really open and transparent. And we're subject to freedom of information requests as well. So we're not hiding anything. People can ask us questions or put information requests into us about our work. So yeah, I think I would say please get in touch if you've got a question or you want to have a conversation.
Now, I've got to ask you this, and it's just one of those questions everybody asks, are those that are being paid, particularly at the top, at the executive, being paid too much? Because it has been pointed out that some of the salaries are quite high.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not one of those people, so I'm not getting paid that much. But I guess that's for someone else to decide, and that is actually what happens. The decision about how much our chief executive and how much the executive colleagues get paid is looked at independently, and they decide that based on benchmarking against other businesses or charities. If you think of it, if we were a business, not a charity, we've got 2,000 miles of publicly accessible open network. We're spending hundreds of millions of pounds every year. It's quite a responsibility. We've got health and safety issues to think about, heritage issues, environmental issues. It's for someone to consider what is appropriate to pay our chief exec, and that's what happens. It's set by an independent remunerations committee, not by the chief exec themselves or the executive members.
And how much are you lent on by the government to do certain things? I mentioned about the green agenda stuff and the net zero things, but do the government get involved and say, look, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, or and how much do you get any subsidies from the government at all?
So yes, we get a grant at the moment. So when the charity was set up, part of that founding agreement was that the government would give us a grant over 15 years. It hasn't been inflation linked, which has obviously been a bit more challenging in
Yes, I
recent
should
years.
think so.
So it's been about a quarter of our income over the life of the charity, but it is rapidly reducing. And over the next sort of 10 years, they've just announced that it's going to reduce year on year even more. So, over the life of our charity, that's about a £300 million gap in funding that we are seeing as that income reduces. But as part of that grant, there are certain things that we agree to do. So, for example, maintaining the structures to a certain degree, keeping the towpaths open for people to use. So it's things like that that are in that agreement. But other than that, we're an independent charity. So, the government, when it was British Waterways, it was the minister could decide yes or no and instruct British Waterways what to do. But as an independent charity, the government doesn't have that role. It can't do that. So we're able to set our own priorities and work with boaters and other communities and users of the waterways to prioritise what we do.
Fantastic. Let me just put up your webpage so we can have a look at that so people can find out more about you. Canalrivertrust.org.uk.
And there's one of the fantastic volunteering opportunities you could do, get down and dirty in a lock if you wanted to.
I've not done that myself, but I've been to a lock and been right down to the bottom. It is fascinating just how deep they are, and then you see at the bottom the cobbled stones or the brickwork. I mean, those people who made them originally did an incredible job. And here we go. You've got somebody
Yeah. So
demonstrating that.
we've got an open day, I think, coming up in Wolverhampton in a few weeks' time, where people could go and down into the lock and see that as it's being worked on.
And there you're showing people who are out there picking up the rubbish. Do you get a lot of problems with rubbish and fly tipping and things?
So fortunately, in a lot of places, people are considerate, but we do have issues with fly tipping and people, inconsiderate people leaving their rubbish or their dog waste along. But thankfully, most people are considerate, and we have a big thing called the plastic challenge, where we encourage people go to the waterways, pick up a bit of plastic, take it away with you. Because if everyone who visited our waterways took one bit of plastic away with them, there'd be no plastic in a year. So you
Yes.
can make a big difference.
And also people who have dogs, if only they could just make sure their dogs
I
don't
have
do
two
their
dogs,
doing,
and yeah, take it away with you, please.
which would be good. I want to also thank, whilst I'm here, the very kind people at Canals Online magazine, who have asked a number of their viewers if they wanted to submit questions. And I admit that I haven't, as I said before, I've not sort of put them, because that's not the way I work on this channel. But all these sort of places like this, I mean, obviously it's good to hold bodies like yourself to account, because you have that duty to look after our heritage, landscape and nature, and the canals themselves are very much a major part. That's the Canal magazine, canalsonline.uk, where I'll put the links in the description. And as you said, you have no problem with people sort of doing that. I think that's I've just lost where you are, actually. Where are you? Hang on, let me just find you again. There he is.
Hello again.
Hello again. Yes, so if people do have these sort of questions, and they want to have these sort of problems with you, and as you said, you're very open to that, which is good. And it is important to be under scrutiny and have people put you on notice and say, look, we just disagree with these policies. Do boaters help change the policies that you make?
Absolutely. We have voters who are represented on something called our Trust Council. We have different advisory groups that include many voters as well, that help inform how we do things, our policies, help us with difficult decisions that we have to make. So yeah, absolutely, get involved. And we're really keen that people play a part in looking after the waterways, which, as I said, are something we hold in trust for everybody. They're not as privately, they're for everyone to enjoy.
Fantastic. Well, before I go and let you go back to the splendid work that you're doing, I've got to ask, how many people on the executive board actually have boats or go boating?
That's a good question. Well, I know they all go boating because I make sure they go boating. How
Fantastic.
many of them have boats? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I know that our trustees, the volunteer trustees who sort of are at top of our governance structure, several of those are boaters. So we do have boaters right at the top of the organisation.
Yes, so they can actually see if there are problems, they get,
Yeah.
because the best way, I think is like when you get the bosses of anything down on the workshop floor, and you get the authentic voice of the worker going, "All these bloody machines, they just don't work."
If you're out on the waterways this summer, you have a good chance of bumping into our chief executive, because he likes nothing better than to get out and meeting boaters.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. Matthew Simmons there from the CRT, coming on to answer my questions, influenced by some others who've written in. And I thank everybody who's been interested in this. I imagine that there's always going to be problems on both sides on something so huge and so important in the country. And I mean, Matthew, you're not going to solve everybody's problems. but I dare say you're trying to solve as many as others.
We are trying,
Brilliant.
and we do it
Fantastic.
together. So
And you do. So there we
thanks to all the
go.
volunteers who help us as well.
So thank you very much, Matthew. I will be back with more monologues and wonderful interviews on all sorts of fascinating subjects. Don't forget to stay in touch. But in the meantime, big thanks to Matthew and for you for watching. And I'll be back at some point in the future with more. Until then, from Matthew and I, bye-bye.